And that concludes questions for oral answer. I have received a letter from the Honourable David Parker seeking to debate Understanding Order 389, the release of Michael Heron's QC independent review into the Ministry of Primary Industries' handling of the illegal dumping of fish. This is a matter of recent occurrence involving ministerial responsibility. Earlier this year, I declined an application to debate the launch of this inquiry because at that time it did not warrant setting aside the business of the House. However, the inquiry has now concluded and the government has accepted its findings. Commercial fishing makes a significant contribution to the New Zealand economy. Its continued success requires effective management of the quota system and effective compliance activity. The Heron report goes to the very integrity of New Zealand's fisheries management. This issue is of significant importance to warrant setting aside the usual business of the House. I therefore call on the Honourable David Parker to move that the House take note of a matter of urgent public business.
Mr Speaker,
the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 16th of May, the University of British Columbia, in concert with the University of Auckland, released a report on the fish returns in New Zealand, saying that the only way that the New Zealand fish landing records could be correct is if somehow New Zealand fish, unlike the rest of the world, miraculously sort themselves into good fish and less valuable fish, and all the good fish line up and go into the net, and all of the low-value species and all of the specimens that are below good commercial value and all of those that are too big, somehow they escape the net and they're never reported. That's essentially what the report said on the 16th of May. They said that the New Zealand returns are wrong, that New Zealand grossly, not just by some marginal amount, but grossly under-records the amount of fish that is caught in the quota management system. Sir, what was the immediate response of the ministry? The ministry said, no, there's nothing to look at here. And I've got the release of the 16th of May 2016, quoting the MPI Directives of Fisheries Management, Dave Turner, saying that the review, that they've got concerns about the methodology and conclusions. And then on the second page of it, it said, MPI takes any suggestion of illegal fishing activity, including dumping, seriously. Where evidence is available, MPI will investigate and prosecute. Who was that? Dave Turner from the Fisheries Management team at MPI. Now, within a couple of days of that, a leaked report came out of MPI, in fact a series of leaked reports, the most serious of which is probably the Achilles report, Operation Achilles. What did that report show? That report showed gross breaches of New Zealand's fishing laws. I've got the report here. There were two reports. The first report recommended that all permit holders who had been shown to be grossly under-reporting catch by chucking the bycatch away, it recommended that all permit holders and skippers be dealt with by way of prosecution. And it said at paragraph 1.4, these recommendations are based on each of the parties satisfying the evidential and public interest tests as set out in the Solicitor General's prosecution guidelines. Now, when that came out, what happened? Well, we had the same officials who had leaked to the defence of the ministry at the time. They said, in respect of the Achilles prosecution, they said, and I'm quoting from what this was said on TV3 by the same Dave Turner, we ended up with a legal opinion that we could not prosecute fishermen for discarding fish because the cameras had been placed on the vessels for the purposes of monitoring a trial in relation to protected species. Now, was that correct? Did the Heron report find that's correct? No. In fact, the Heron report found that that wasn't correct. Who else took to the media that day? Another senior person at the ministry, the Deputy Director General, Scott Gallagher. And what did he say on the day on TV3? He said, unfortunately, there was not enough evidence to prosecute. Really? What did the Heron report say in respect of that? The Heron report said there was enough evidence to prosecute. Although one of the reports from Crown Law to the Ministry of Fisheries has not been released in full because privilege has not been waived, it's pretty clear from the report that the Crown Law advice was that there was enough evidence to prosecute, and yet there was no prosecution. And for 3 years, the ministry not only sat on their hands, they suppressed the reports, so much so that the lower level officers within MPI, who were aghast at this protracted and illegal practice, which was so pervasive in the industry and not being policed, in the end leaked the document, which is why it has come into the open. Now, what did the minister say back then? The minister said, and this is Minister Guy, on the 18th of May 2016, regarding the investigations into the illegal fish dumping, he said, and I quote him, "There's been no cover-up here. These are internal draft investigations, part of which has been unfortunately leaked." So the minister's getting on the lack. There's nothing to see here, nothing that's been done wrong by MPI. There is no evidence of illegal fish dumping. There's been no cover-up. That's what the minister was saying on the 18th of May. It became, within a matter of days, incredible for the government to maintain that stance and to continue saying there's nothing to look at here. And so they got Michael Heron QC to carry out a report. Now, what does he say? Well, Mr. Heron's done a thorough report into the former Solicitor General, the lead prosecutor for the Crown in the land, and he starts by recounting the University of Auckland study that they'd done with the University of British Columbia. And unlike the minister and the ministry, he's not quick to wave it aside. He doesn't say this is a junk inquiry, which still is the ministry's position in respect of these things. He says that as a result of the news that followed that up and the leaking of the Achilles report, amongst others, there were two others, one was Hippocamp. Don't think I'll have time to go into all of them, but in respect of those, he says that it's wrong that the assertion that has been made that there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. And he says it is wrong, the assertion that there was some deal that somehow this could not be prosecuted. I want to divert just slightly into another issue, which I won't deal with in as much detail, but the camera footage on this Operation Achilles also showed the bringing on board in nets of dolphins that had been caught in the nets and killed. They're drowned. The dolphins are drowned. And that's a terrible thing. What did the video footage show? It showed the fishermen letting the net out again and flushing out the dolphins. In fact, one of them was so entangled they could only get rid of the evidence on one, and they actually had to bring the other dolphin on board. Again, was there anything public about that at the time? Did the ministry say we've got problems in respect of dolphin bycatch and we found evidence of this, but because of this? No, absolute silence. Why is this level of silence and incompetence at upper echelons within MPI allowed to continue for year after year after year? Mr. Speaker, I'm going to go back to the issue of the bycatch. So, Justice Mike Heron QC, in his report, goes through the law and says that if they're subject to limited exceptions, if it's a quota species, then you're meant to take all of the substandard ones as well. You're not meant to dump them. And if it's bycatch, if it's not the quota species that you're targeting, you're meant to take that and you're meant to return that in your fish returns, and you're meant to have some. You have to pay for a right to fish that bycatch as well. And he goes through some of the complexities of that, and he points out that it's not all easy to police. But then he says, well, it can't be too hard. At least one of the vessels that was being looked at did it all legally. If one of the vessels can do it all legally, why can't the others? If one of the vessels can do it legally, why is it MPI doesn't think it should be requiring the others to? Because the other thing that's become clear in these reports is this isn't just a one instant breach. This problem has been there for years, and it appears, although I haven't quite got to the bottom of this, it appears that for the last 5 years, the ministry's been talking about doing something about it. It's just in the last 5 years, they haven't. For 5 years, during the period when they've been developing these new electronic techniques and for better monitoring, the widespread illegal practice that they have known, which has been occurring, has not been prosecuted. The most obvious example is in the Achilles example, but I suspect that's just the tip of the iceberg. And if the report from the University of Auckland and the University of British Columbia is right—
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the report from the universities is right, then the amount of this illegal dumping is enormous. It's not just a small amount, it's enormous. And indeed, in the Achilles operation, they found that fully half of the elephant fish being fished, which is quite a common species, half of it was being thrown away. Half of it. Not 10%, not 5%, half of it. It's unbelievable, as my colleague says, sir. So for this to go wrong, was it some isolated person making a mistake within the ministry? No, this went up very senior in the ministry, and there is correspondence between Scott Gallagher and David Turner, who are both very senior within the ministry, very senior, at least one of whom has moved on. We're told it's for unrelated reasons, but that's, I think that deserves a little bit of scrutiny as well. These two people effectively had to agree between themselves before the prosecution would be dumped. And did they? Yes, they did. There's another aspect that worries me in this. There's an internal memo which is dated the 2nd of October 2014. It's got the names obscured, but you can actually work it out from the report that it's actually from Dave Turner to Scott Gallagher, the two people that I've talked about. I'm sure that's when I reconstruct this. And at the end, having discussed sort of the pros and cons, and he said, if you do decide to warn rather than prosecute, I would suggest talking to name blanked out. I'm curious to who that person is blanked out. Hey, I would suggest, if you do decide to warn, I would suggest talking to name blanked out. This same person has swung on side on a lot of issues lately, and walking him through this matter would give him a good understanding of the issues that I think he knows are real anyway, but would show how we are being considered and looking at the big picture. He's a lot of influence over fishers and could be an important driver of change. Who is that? I reckon that's likely to be an industry participant. And I think that's evidence of the fact that the ministry may have been captured by industry interests. Why else would they be saying, well, look, don't prosecute, just talk to this person on the side who's been helpful in the past? I don't know who it is, Mr. Mallard. I don't know who it is. It could be someone completely different. The other thing is, why did they choose not to prosecute? Well, again, Heron says for the wrong reasons, partly because they were embarrassed that it would show up that previously they hadn't prosecuted. So this wasn't the first time. This just perpetuates it. They say, well, look, we'd be embarrassed because it would show up that previous times we've let people get away with it and not prosecuted. Mr. Speaker, this really calls into question the validity of what we think is the sustainability of our QMS system. These data errors are not minor, they are large. We do not know how pervasive it is. We've got independent research coming out of the universities saying that the data is complete rubbish, or that not complete rubbish, but the flaws are so gross that you have to question it. There is no doubt in my mind that this causes, that there is serious doubt as to whether our fishery is being fished sustainably or whether stocks are being driven down. Now, I know the ministry come along and they say, oh, well, there's abundant fish, therefore there is no problem. But that is not so much these days based on science as catch effort. And we don't know whether, as a consequence of these misreporting, they've got those calculations wrong. And to be perfectly honest, I don't trust the ministry to do that independently by themselves. The first time we've had an inquiry independently into any of this, we have found serious wrongdoing, and we have had a cover-up for years that inquiry has shown to have taken place, despite the minister's queries. I feel very misled by those senior officials who said there was no evidence and there was a deal that meant that they could not be prosecuted. Both of those assertions were made in the media to protect the position of the ministry. They were both made directly to the media, deliberately. One at a time, it was also backed up in writing at the time. I think we need to question those ministry officials, and I think we need to get to the bottom of this with some further independent scrutiny of what's been going on in MPI.
The Honourable Nathan Guy.